Good afternoon. Are we all here? Yeah. Thanks, David. A few distractions over to the side. Right, well, I've got Esley joining me also here today. We've pre-circulated the slide decks. The idea is, for a little bit of efficiency, we'll do a quick page turn through the presentation. Happy to take questions as we go through each slide, but really the key outcome and next steps for this process is a resolution of council to go out to public consultation. So that's going to hit the 14th of September agenda, along with the next steps around legal review. So really just giving you the background here today. It's a process that's been in train for some time, so it's not in response to the recent flooding events, but it certainly gives some more clout and responsibility for council to look at education and enforcement around some of the longer term issues. So it's not a direct response of recent flood events. So on that note, I'll hand over to Esley, and like we say, happy to take questions as we move through those slides.
Thank you, Daniel. So, good afternoon. So in this meeting, what we're going to be covering is introduction, need for proposed bylaw, main components of the stormwater bylaw, bylaw development process, the process that we went through, and consequential actions. So as you may all know, council is responsible for stormwater in towns and other settlements, along with roads as well. And as we experiencing climate change and also increasing environmental standards, and the growth puts significant challenges to council's management of stormwater. Currently council has got very little control over contaminants entering the public stormwater at this stage, and however, it's responsible for the quality of the stormwater discharges. Council is also in the process of applying resource consent from the horizons for this discharges. So that currently there are two resource consent applications are in process. One of them is Lebanon stormwater discharge into Lake Horowhenua, and the other one is Foxton Beach stormwater discharge. So need for proposed bylaw. Why do we need the bylaw? So currently there are 5 perceived problems that the bylaw will address. And these are listed here. So first one is lack of maintenance of private stormwater systems, and as it's known, most of the properties, they do have private sewage pit on the properties. Need for access to inspect stormwater infrastructure on private properties. Contaminants entering the public stormwater network. Damage to various services from adjacent construction work. And the last point is growth requiring new connections in public stormwater network, where the soil conditions may not be may be challenging, especially.
When you say lack of maintenance of private stormwater systems, and you're talking about soak pits, if those soak pits are full because the water table is full, what sort of maintenance would you be expecting people to do in their properties?
So there are two. Yes, you're right. One of the factors is the high groundwater level, and the other factor is that people may be unaware of that they do have the salt pit, and they may not have either sufficient information, or they might lack the knowledge to be able to maintain the salt pit. So there are two factors, and the factor with the high water, with the high groundwater level, that would be addressed differently.
It's probably 0.5 around the growth, but the example around the lack of maintenance is where 20 years ago a subdivision was built, it might have worked fine and it was signed off and approved, then all of a sudden the soaklet fills up with silt, it's no longer working, it floods the neighbour or actually floods out into council stormwater network. So that cumulative effect, if you've got a number of properties that just simply their original facilities aren't functioning, the idea is that council could go in and enforce that. But the idea would be to start with the education side, to educate people around that options. But potentially, particularly when it's causing a nuisance and flooding a neighbour, it can cause some quite serious issues.
How do you do maintenance on a soak pit that's been there for 40 years?
Well, in some cases, you're faced with having to dig the thing up and start again.
So I bought a house 40 years ago, which has got code of compliance. I lived there for 40 years. Someone knocks on my door one day and goes, "No, at your expense, you have to dig all this up and we want to have a look at it, and then you have to comply with the new rules." And you're talking about just about every house in the Horowhenua, I believe.
Yeah, that's the theory, but effectively next steps is actually to go through a public consultation process. So it's really too early to make a call either way, but those are some of the challenges that we're facing, and part of the process is to go out and talk to the community and to work through the consultation process that will ultimately come to a decision.
So our stormwater rights, if you like, at the moment end at the code of compliance stage. So in order to get code of compliance, you have to prove you've got your drainage that's required for that particular area, etc. And then after that, we can't go on and check what's going on there. Is that right? Or is that...
What in an open drain, yes, we can check. However, we need to go through a process, getting inspection rights, and in for example, problematic areas are mainly in high risk areas, and those high risk areas are heavy industries, and that's where heavy industries. Yeah, that's where the quality of the stormwater management needs to be really managed well.
Just on our stormwater network, is it actually a network, or is it very big?
Yeah, Lavinia talking, there's quite a large network, and I suppose what we're alluding to is that council is ultimately responsible for what comes out the bottom end and consent requirements. So this process will actually give us more control over what's tipped in at the top end around sinks and metals and industrial areas and the like. So it's really formalising that process to manage what's coming into the network.
It would be thousands of metres or hundreds of metres. I know on the select committee this morning we were listening to Water Care in Auckland, and they said, would they say 8,000 kilometres or something of pipes? Yeah.
On top of my head, I'm not 100%. On top of my head, I think it's around less than 200 kilometres, and mainly that's in Ribbon, Foxton Beach. In rural areas, we do have less stormwater and Whitehead Beach. And that's just the pipe network. And then on top of the pipe network, we do have open drainage, and that's again lots of kilometers. So the main components of the proposed bylaw is these points here. So I'm going to be going through the purpose, definitions and scope, protection of the public stormwater network, connecting to the public stormwater network, private stormwater systems, and bylaw enforcement and administration. So the purpose, as you can see, I'm not going to be reading probably full sentences. So manage and develop and maintenance and use of public stormwater network. Protect and regulate the public stormwater network. So that entails pretty much all the open drainage structures, pipe network, ensure that discharges into public stormwater network are appropriately managed. So that's where it comes. That's where the private properties or land entails. Ensure that private stormwater systems are maintained and operated in accordance with the intended function and design to protect the public from nuisance and promote and maintain public health and safety. That's one of the reasons that we have installed downstream defender. That's still downstream of the source point. But what we're trying to address here is the contaminant, be able to control the contaminant at the source.
But I heard Daniel say it was very cool that it was about education or bringing people along. Is there a place for that statement in the purpose about, bringing greater understanding across the district of how stormwater networks operate?
So part of this, there will be a huge education campaign, and we will provide that education to our community.
Yeah, it's probably inferred, indirectly in the purpose statements. It's not sort of sitting there up front. But certainly the first step is around education before enforcement. You'll see later on, but we'd go away through that legal review process, take this feedback into account around some tweaks to that word.
So Dan, just playing the devil's advocate here, like building a house today, your requirements for a soak pit are 20 times the size they were 30 years ago. You know what I mean? From my experience, from what I know. I'm guessing there, but they're massive now compared to what they used to be. So I would say that just about every house built less than 10 years ago is massively, to today's rules, soak pits are way too small, right? So, but how are you going to go on and enforce that when there's no space for it, or because it's been signed off by us? This could cause massive dramas.
And I suppose that's where through this process we need to find that balance. If we just simply say carry on cumulatively making that problem worse, so particularly with infill, if we've got a house that doesn't have adequate soakage currently, and we just keep adding to that problem, so that is really the pathway. And the first step is around that education, and in terms of the nuisance element, it really gives us that ability where if it's just overflowing out into a road, we may be able to accommodate that. But if every property in the district's overflowing into the road to a point it's causing a lot of downstream issues, this provides the ability to actually go and address some of those. So it's not to say we need to roll out a blanket, retrofit across the district, but if someone's got a responsibility to manage their stormwater under the district plan, they're creating a nuisance to flood their neighbours. This gives us the tool to go and to firstly educate them that they shouldn't, that they have a problem, and it's their responsibility to go some way to address that.
The problem won't be with infill though, will it? Because I'm doing some infill at the moment, and the Sagas bins are massive. So, and that's the rules now, which is obviously big enough to cope with it. You know what I mean? So, I'm just worried about how far this law goes to everybody else. That, you know what I mean? I understand why you're trying to do it, but I could just, looking at the worst case scenario, it could be a horror story for everyone that owns a house in Horowhenua.
Yeah, you make a good point. The infill, its size, it works really well today. But fast forward 10 years down the track, if those facilities haven't been maintained, then all of a sudden they could be causing issues for the neighbouring properties and the like. So that's really where a lot of the education will start, is around problem spots in the network that aren't down to council's network issues. It's actually down to private individuals who aren't able to manage their stormwater, be it quantity, which seems to be the focus, but the other element is really around that water quality, that we can't just simply pull out contaminants, be it going through people's private stormwater or spewing over from a industrial development out into a urban channel and the like. So really about quality and quantity. So it's not a blanket increase it to a certain level. It's providing the tools to educate and enforce the right stormwater solutions.
So, could this be at odds with the district plan, which is allowing, moving a house forward and putting other ones behind it? All these ideas to intensify. How is there going to be anything to actually put in the suffrage or the stormwater networks that need to happen? I would have thought there'd be a lot of room left on the section of city that's so much.
Yes, I think just probably get the context that the stage in this process, it's been in train for some time, but the very next step is to get that legal review, then go out for consultation. So it's in development. The driver was identified some time ago that council can't control what's coming into its system. So some of those finer details could be worked through, but we're not expecting that this is getting into that technical element around sizing of stormwater networks. There is a very different separate work stream around those types of activities in district plan rules that we won't be going into through this process.
Dan, do you want me to just hold off? I've got a few questions. Would you rather just get through that and wrap them up at the end?
Might be good if we could wrap them up, just to sort of run through the slides.
I just wanted to reply Councillor Mason. Part of the scope bylaw creation, so council has to go through some a process, so that is under the review. That is a review under section 155 of the Local Government Act, and there are some sections that we have to go through. So if I just read, so section 145 of the Local Government Act, so that enables local authorities to make bylaw under protecting the public from the nuisance, protecting, promoting and maintaining the public health and safety, and minimizing the potential of offensive behavior in public places. And section 146, 1B3 of the Act enables territorial authorities to make bylaws for its district for the purpose that we just outlined. So it has gone through a the process why it needs to be done. And part of in here, so in here actually, public education is actually one of the tools that it will be used. Yeah.
I think if we remind ourselves about why we're here today, so why we're here is obviously this is a public workshop where we've got a document that in time will come to council for adoption to go out for consultation. And this is the checking in, the testing, the kind of purpose of the bylaw. So I think what we've heard is some feedback that kind of role of education is a tool within our bylaw needs to be reflected in our purpose. And that's really good feedback for us to know. Thank you, Councillor Mason.
Okay, so protection of the public stormwater network. So here listed prohibited activities, for example, obstructing drains, blocking flow paths, prevention of the contamination. So this is actually quite important for this bylaw. So requires stormwater contamination management plan for all industrial activities, for some trade activities where there is a risk of stormwater contamination. So this is actually quite important part of the proposed stormwater bylaw. Prescribe how works and construction in the proximity to the stormwater system may take place, and also places a duty of care on all persons to report contaminant entry to the stormwater system. There are some good public citizens who actually makes that sort of communication to us currently. Connecting to the public stormwater networks. So this one sets out the approval process for connection and disconnections, and clarifies the responsibility for costs associated with each connection. So I guess part of the growth and part of the infill, this might be a consideration. Private stormwater system. So this sets out the responsibility on the owners to maintain private systems, seek approval from the council for changes in the system. For example, if individuals want to amend the current system, then they need to inform council. And council grants access to council access to private property for the purpose of inspecting for unauthorized connections and or monitor public assets on private properties. Bylaw enforcement and administration. So this one sets out the offences and penalties, sets out the fees and charges regime, and sets review date. So bylaw development process, as I mentioned earlier on, so it's received section 155 review and need for a bylaw. So that's completed and that will be shared. So receiving draft bylaw, determine it is the most appropriate form of the bylaw. So this is the elected members' brief workshop. Identify if any implication on using the Bill of Rights Act. So this will be completed. This will be completed after the workshop. So that's the legal review. And the next step is to special consultative procedures, so statement of proposal, and that's a full council meeting. So that's 14th of September. And after 14th of September, that consultation will start hopefully sometime, well, will take place sometimes October, November this year. And then hearings and deliberations hopefully will happen sometimes in February, March time. And the final process is to adopt the bylaw hopefully in April 2023. So this is the consequential impacts. As we talked about education, so there will be a need to educate people about the bylaw and enable them to take action to avoid enforcement. So this is actually will be quite important part of the bylaw, especially on the maintenance of the private stormwater systems, development of stormwater contamination management plans. So that's for the high-risk areas. And the next part would be enforcement. Council needs to be prepared to carry out monitoring and inspections and to take enforcement action where breaches cannot be resolved by education. So education is the first part, and the next part is the enforcement.
So about that, following on from what Joe said around doing with not to, I'd see it a step before educating about the bylaw, and that's just educating people in general about their soak pits, and I would prefer to come from an angle like, we're experiencing more rain events, you or your neighbours getting flooded, help thy neighbour or even yourself. Do you know where your soak pit is? Have you checked that lately? Do you know what it takes to maintain it? Like all of that, because some of that might seem basic, but actually Todd's right. People don't necessarily know, even if they buy an existing home, where the soak pit is or what to do with it, or that it's even redundant now. So I'd rather educate from that angle and then go on to say, well, because we're now introducing the bylaw, that means blah, blah, blah. And if you can't do X, Y, Z, then, because I don't want them to just, this is what we're doing, and we're going to enforce it. Then you watch out, you'll be in trouble if if you get caught or it's not working or you're affecting the public system or network. So can you go back to education and do a step ahead of that?
We can. We are actually in the process of starting that process from the contamination point and also from maintaining the soak pits on the private properties. Yeah. So we are in the process of developing that.
I just want to make it plain that is an actual.
Yeah, I suppose it's, not everyone gets particularly excited about the bylaws and the legalities and all the words that sit behind it, but maybe I'm hearing we need to create some flow charts to sort of, step through the process and what it might look like. And it might be particularly around the quality side that we set some bottom lines around gross contamination, but it might, the starting point would be to say, hey, you're at risk of contamination and we're not accusing you of anything, but maybe we help you with some templates to create these.
Sometimes it's not necessarily what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah.
And then they, people receive it better and then actually want to help, want to do something about it.
Yep.
And you're not having to get all 4
as well.
No.
With most people, yeah.
Yeah, so some messaging around the carrot. The stick needs to sit there, but certainly, in the way that it's pitched, when we go out for consultation, it certainly needs to be around dealing with the serious issues to fix those problems, but really very much an amnesty period and the like around how we approach our education and starting that quite early is what we're hearing.
I think also, Councillor Chippewa, as you go back to the slide where it kind of showed the time frame, that we're not talking enforceable by law until March next year. And so actually that gives plenty of time for this organisation to ramp up its approach around telling the story, describing the why, giving, and almost, I don't know, in my head I'm kind of wondering like the summer campaign for getting ready for winter in summer. There's probably off the back of what's been a terrible winter, some work we can do around the broader stormwater conversation, not just obviously the bylaw, but other stuff.
Yeah, just picking up on Pirihena's point, I guess like that kind of guidance note around like what are property owners' obligations right now, because I imagine that one is to have the private system in particular, and then obviously there's a certain amount of water flow that can leave the property, right? And so starting with that whole, what is the actual obligation, right? What do people actually have to meet? I think that's probably useful for us to also understand. And just picking up on Deputy Mayor Mason's point about the education enforcement, we have a standalone enforcement policy, don't we? We have a policy about enforcement which sets out the tools that we use, like from education through to enforcement, but in terms of the hierarchy, so that should set out our approach to not using the stick straight away. I don't know. And then just the other thing I just wanted to test in terms of the purpose of the bylaw. So it's sort of almost like two categories you've said, which is the heavy industry, which is adding in contaminants into the stormwater system, and then talking about private dwellings, essentially, that are adding stormwater into the system, which is increasing the amount of volume that we're able to get, right? So just testing at the moment, if we're aware that a property has got a private system that doesn't work and they're introducing a whole lot of volume of stormwater into the system that they shouldn't be, how do we deal with that situation at the moment?
So at the moment, what we're trying to do is to identify those properties with stormwater issues, and what we're trying to do is to actually and also bring some solutions with it, options with it. I do understand that there are some properties that it's quite challenging, and we will need to address those.
I guess what I'm testing is this bylaw is intended to give you a power or a tool to go and do something in theory that you can't do already, right? So that's what I guess I'm just trying to test, is that are we saying at the moment, if we identify a specific property where their private system is not working and they're introducing that additional volume into the stormwater system, that we can't do anything about it right now? I mean, obviously we can do things like consent and talking to the owner, but there's no way that we could coerce or ensure compliance.
To be perfectly honest, we're in response mode right now, and one of the benefits of going through a process like this will be to actually gain some collective momentum, firstly around the education, but then actually resourcing what those priority areas are when we are in the middle of a 6-month of enduring rain event. So at the moment, it's someone's ringing up, they're getting flooded from the neighbours. We're sending contractors out with a pump to just help the situation, to keep it below 4 levels and the like. in peace times, I suppose it's a matter of actually trying to work out where it's coming from, what some of those longer term solutions are, and some of those council will be able to deliver now, and some of them they can work with landowners. But this would allow a coordinated approach to firstly educate, to work collaboratively. But the final element would be that there's actually some stick there to enforce some of those procedures. So it's just going to provide a coordinated focus on that around the bylaw itself, to actually capture some of that other work that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think the bond, like what I'm saying, I could look at the other night, because we know Dan and team how much resources going into stormwater issues around the district right now. It's huge, it's immense, nothing I've ever seen before, and probably going to continue to see. So the question probably around, I think, coming out of the National Stormwater Task Force meeting last week, was where does this fit with the overall strategy around stormwater management? Because the bottom is good, it's only part of the solution, and I think we're recognising fast that the traditional ways of dealing with stormwater in this district are no longer suitable. And I know firsthand from some of the people I've been dealing with face to face in conversations with the council officers around it, is the conflict between what the district plan allows, what the land drainage act says you can do, which conflicts with quite often common sense and reality. So it's our overall stormwater strategy that I think is really, really important. This is good. And I agree with some education, but at some stage, a lot of people know when they're putting their stormwater into their sewage system, they shouldn't be doing it. I've been reading about this stuff for years, and I've seen council communications for years, so happy, absolutely, with any type of enforcement's got that education period, but at some stage there's got to be the hard conversation that that's no longer acceptable. And then I guess the other question for me, Malik, Dan, whoever, is currently do we have capability to enforce the bylaw, or is that something we're going to have to look at resourcing? Because bylaws are only as good, any enactment is only as good as the tools to enforce. If you've got no tools to enforce, it's not going to work. So one the bylaw, and two, the overall strategy of how we now deal with stormwater, or how we're going to in the future.
Yeah, and part of that Stormwater Task Force discussion is around that longer term resourcing, which will be conversations that have to come back in parallel to this. So just reiterating the point that this is something that's been in train since earlier this year, 6-12 months in the making. It's happening to coincide with a large rainfall event. So in some ways, it could be looked at as this is the solution to that. Well, it's not. There is a wider conversation around resourcing the district plan, how those soakage systems will work in parallel with the theories around climate change and those types of impacts. So there's a much wider stormwater conversation, and it's had historically a different level of resourcing to our water and waste networks.
I wonder if we just come back to that question from Councillor Jennings around the enforcement policy, which, as I understand, isn't a formal policy, but maybe Mr. Harvey can give an update on that work, given compliance now fits under his portfolio. No pressure.
Thanks, Monique. The development of the compliance strategy was identified as part of the council market assessment in August 2021. So the drafting of the compliance strategy is underway, and it's supported by the documents and the compliance and enforcement guidelines. So that work is happening at the moment. I don't have a time frame on when it will be complete.
King Leslie, thanks. I'm a bit cynical about enforcement of bylaws for a start, because I see dogs that shouldn't be walking our streets and the main streets still do, and I don't think that's ever changed. So little things like that. I just wondered too where we were with our other agencies like NZTA, because a lot of the impacts that we have with stormwater are impacted across. They're the ones that are going to fix it up rather than us in terms of some of the issues that we have. I wondered where horizons were in this conversation, because I hope that we're not just going to treat them as a submitter, that we are trying to work with them to work out a solution in terms of that, and also obviously Iwi in terms of that space as well. And the other question I had was around the lake consents. Are we putting the cart before the horse? Should we not making sure that we get those consents sorted and understood before we actually create a bylaw?
I suppose just reiterating the need to focus on what's coming into the network, and part of those consents for Lake Horowhenua will have stringent requirements around water quality, and some of that early data that we're picking up is that there's a need to focus on where those contaminants are coming from, which the education and the enforcement around that, if necessary, would be managed through the bylaw process. So it's something that we see as it's been identified previously that there's a need for that, and this would actually provide some of that opportunity to focus on those improvements to achieve those consents.
Piece of the puzzle that it needs to be done to be able to control the quality of the stormwater.
This might be a really dumb question, so I don't know if it's for you guys, it's for me, but I just say, by us putting a bylaw in, especially a blanket one like this, where you can go into private properties and what happens when Three Waters comes in and does this bylaw give them the power then? Or is it I don't know, because it's a part of the Three Waters, so
Yes, no, it won't, because a bylaw comes under the umbrella of the Local Government Act, and obviously Entity C, or whatever they're called, they're not an entity of local government, so therefore they won't be able to use this bylaw. However, the mechanisms of both, or less so the current legislation in the House, but more so the second legislation, will be about giving the entities powers to do what they need to do. I suspect what will happen in the early kind of days of the transition is that the entity will come to council and they will want us to continue to keep our stormwater bylaw operational and give warrants and delegate warrants to the entity. So that idea that, let's say in March you adopt the bylaw, that then gives me as the CA power to warrant staff to have particular delegations and abilities to enforce the bylaw. Entity C will, I suspect, come to us and look to us to do that for their staff. But it's one of those kind of to be confirmed answers.
So, Monique, does that mean the power sits still with the council, or does the power sit still with Entity C? Because I know my worry with this, right, and I understand why we need it, and I agree what we need it for these things, but it is such a blanket policy over all of our district that you could cripple people and people could lose houses because they can't do some of the things that are in here. Now, I understand there's the need to do it in some places, but this is so blanketed, and what's to stop Entity C walking and go, you know what, I want a warrant on every property in the Horowhenua, and this is the new rule going forward, and you've got a year to go. People just won't be able to afford it or be able to do it. That's what worries me with it.
I think it's actually a really good question, and it does raise the point of, well, if it's we're waiting to July 24, well, why don't we just wait? But the fact is, I think the point was raised earlier around education, so that situation could very well happen under an entity. Decisions will be made, but the opportunity that sits here to go through that consultation process get the bylaw embedded 12 months at least ahead of any discussion around a transition of warrants and responsibilities will actually give us some time to start getting out there and focusing on that education with the community. So there's, that education part of it is a huge first step. There's still a lot of work to be worked through with the transition. There's still a lot of work to do in that space, but we're of the opinion, and really that'll be the support that's been sought to go to consultation, that we can't just simply wait and do nothing and hope that all our problems will be fixed in the future. We want to start working on that now.
So I've got similar concerns to Todd, not easy to see, but there are places in this district where solar pits simply won't work because the water table is too high. So will there be something in the bylaw to basically protect the people that can't deal with the stormwater on their own properties because of where those properties are, and which may need to be dealt with later on in a larger council strategic stormwater sort of system? Because I can just imagine in the past, and thinking about how people think about council, well, this council bloke came on and told me that I've got to dig up my soap pit and do it again, but, and I have to do this, but I know it's not going to work, and it's all this cost and stress. So there must somehow be a system, I'd like to see in the bylaw when it goes out for consultation, that it's not blanket across the whole district, that there is an out for those people that can't deal with it on their properties.
Yes, so in the, in here, where is that? So there is a provision for connection into the stormwater network, and that will be decided on a case-by-case basis. Yes, connecting to the public stormwater network. So that will be on a case-to-case basis. However, new developments will have to be, I guess, worked from, like if there's a high water table, then there may need to be a different solution or something. Yeah.
3 brief points. Just on the point that Todd raised. So, that was going to be my devil's advocate question: is why are we bothering with this bylaw and having to go through throwing a whole lot of resources and time at a bylaw that might not have a very long life? Why wouldn't we put all of our energy into that education, providing guidance, working with property owners to try and solve the issues rather than going through this process? Because it's going to a special consultative process is involved. Second question was just under the purpose slide. It talks about public stormwater network, but I understood that one of the issues that we're trying to solve is infiltration into the wastewater network, but that doesn't seem to be specifically referenced, and I just wondered whether it needed to be, if that's one of the objectives. And then the third point was just about bylaws that provide access to private property, always heightened concern for me, because that shouldn't be done lightly. And so I just want to understand, and hopefully this comes through the paper for the 14th September meeting, is there a sort of a graduated process where obviously access should be done by consent, then there's a process by which it's with notice or something, so it's not a situation, unless it's an emergency, where council staff are just going onto private property without sort of a robust process.
It will go through a process, so there will be a notification.
So your why now question, and it's somewhat linked to the uncertainty around the Three Waters transition, but it's very much linked to the earlier question around the consenting process. So we need to actually demonstrate that we're managing, and this is one of those tools to manage the influx into the network. So there's a consenting type element.
But that's my challenge: is why would we go ahead with applying for the consent if we know that these things are going to become HTC's problem in almost 18 months.
I suppose it's that that broader conversation that I don't think we've got a clear strategy on yet, which is what's more important, the outcomes for our community, or kind of the rationalisation of energy levels for council. And I think that we've got to remind ourselves that for Three Waters reform, we need a backup plan, and the backup plan is that reform doesn't happen, and we're then in a position where we've got a whole lot of potential time lost on really important issues, particularly around stormwater. Daniel can probably give you some data off the top of his head, but I can tell you that between January and today, there's been over 800 CRMs coming around the call centre related to stormwater issues. It is the thing that right now is causing headaches everywhere across the organisation, and it's because we haven't dealt with the big scary conversations. And I accept that this isn't bringing the stormwater strategy to the table, Councillor Brannigan. This is simply one part of the jigsaw puzzle. I think there's been some really good feedback around, well, is it the right time? Do we really want to push this right now, or are we better to take an education lens? And I think we can provide some of that advice to the paper that we bring to council for council to debate. But I certainly wouldn't encourage council to kind of, and I'm not suggesting this is what you were suggesting, but I wouldn't suggest that we kind of wash our hands of this altogether. We still have a responsibility to uphold our obligations, and our long-term plan actually talks to this, talks to the work that we're going to do around the stormwater activity.
A couple of quick points, and one's Sam's comments about entry to people's property. Council already has that powers in a number of different ways. If you get in control, for instance, powers of entry to property, councils have a number of enactments that happens, and it needs to. Otherwise, we might just go walk away. Secondly, Chris's point around, I think it was Chris's point around surplus not working. We're already working with the council, we're already working with private properties to find other measures to get rid of stormwater that's ponding and causing problems across some areas, residential areas, commercial areas, by doing things a little bit differently than we historically have. Where a little while ago, the stock clear answer was always no, you must retain good stormwater on property. We know, council know that's no longer possible, and you've got a lot of different measures already happening, so it's good to see it in there. So.
Yeah, just the second question, Councillor Jennings, was around the wastewater connections. That it's not included in here because it's part of our existing policy, and we've got regimes around smoke testing and entry requirements for checking up on those stormwater connections.
Yes. Yeah, problems are included.
So this is running concurrently with all of that other work around, gathering the data from the 800 CRMs and working out the hotspots of where the big issues are. This is another whole separate piece of work. I guess if I was a member of the community submitting on it, I'd say, okay, council, you look like you're putting a big stick out and you spent a third of the money you had allocated in the last financial year on stormwater. There's got to be some better stuff go on in terms of that partnership and not just create a big stick around stormwater, because we've allocated quite a lot of money to stormwater solutions.
Yeah, and I think that's the point earlier that this can be debated at ultimately with that resolution. The recommendation from officers is to go to consultation. The education element is probably small change when compared to some of the reactive costs, not just for council to send out pumps and help people dire need, but also for neighbours that are impacted by the neighbouring properties. Yeah. No further questions? Right on time, thanks.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. This workshop is looking at financial policy reviews. So some of those policies have come up for renewal and they're being reviewed. So just to give you an idea of what we're doing today, so we're bringing to you for review and feedback on the following policies: conflicts of interest prevention, fraud prevention, cohort donations, receiving gifts and sensitive expenditure. And we're also bringing back today a new policy around giving gifts. These are draft policies for your feedback today. The final policies will be brought back to Council at a Council meeting on 14th September for adoption. So, thanks again. Great. I just thought it might be useful to go through and give you an idea of what each of the policies does and who it applies to. So the conflict of interest prevention policy is basically there to give us guidelines for identifying and managing conflicts of interest. And that policy applies to all HD staff and all contractors of HDC. For prevention policy, there are a couple of objectives in here. So one is to promote an anti-fraud culture. So that's obviously looking at promoting behaviours and activities that promote anti-fraud. Developing those internal controls that aid in the detection and prevention of fraud. And so that's, looking at internal controls, how things are authorised, how delegations are applied. And then obviously set out some appropriate actions to be taken in the investigation if there is any fraud discovered. Once again, this policy applies to all HDC staff, counsellors, consultants, suppliers, vendors, contractors, and basically any other party that has a business relationship with council. Cohort donations policy, once again, just setting out some principles and processes that apply to donations and cohort. And that policy applies to all elected members, staff and contractors of HDC. Receiving gifts policy, once again, setting out some guidelines and procedures for acceptance of receiving and documenting gifts. And once again, the policy applies to all HDC staff. Sensitive expenditure policy, once again, is just setting out those principles and guidelines for sensitive expenditure, defining what sensitive expenditure means, and ensuring that sensitive expenditure is accessed, authorised, and reviewed accordingly. Once again, the policy applies to all elected members, staff, and contractors of HDC. And the new policy that we're bringing forward is the giving gifts policy. And once again, it's just setting out principles and processes for giving of gifts. Those are gifts other than cohort, because cohort is obviously under the cohort donations policy. And once again, the policy applies to all elected members, staff and contractors of HDC. Once again, just to give you some understanding of how we've done this process. So Council engaged the services of our internal auditor, CKS audit, to review the policies. And what they did is the policies were compared against the good practice guidelines that are issued from all these organisations. So Officer of the Auditor General issues us some guidelines around what is good practice. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners does also the same thing. And the Institute of Internal Auditors and the Institute of Directors also have guidelines and good practice. And we've compared our policies against what their good practice should be. Once they'd been reviewed by internal auditors, and then they came to council, the draft policies were further reviewed by officers, and then any changes or questions that came out of that process were incorporated into this final drafts that you're going to have a review today. Okay, so just to give you some idea of what changes that were made to policies, there are actually no fundamental changes made to any of the policies. What we did is we put some amendments in there to give greater clarity and to include some examples where applicable. The amendments basically fall into three categories. So that was to remove ambiguity, provide clarity, increase detail, and or increase precision regarding wording. To draw council's attention to where wording should be checked to ensure it aligns with another policy. So there are some of those policies that refer to other policies, and we just make sure that they all line up. And also the last one was just amendments due to suggestions from the OAG and other professional bodies that differed from our current policy. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions, receive some feedback.
Just a couple of small points. Jeff, I noticed there's reference to councillors in one policy and then elected members in another policy, all elected members in another policy. So I think we should be treated the same. The other thing was that the receiving gifts policy does not include elected members, and I assume that we should be. The receiving gifts policy does not. It only talks about HDC staff.
From memory, the OAG guidance doesn't actually include elected members because I've been through this process before. But I've seen councils make the decision that they feel like that the gift policy should, like if, you know, what's good for staff is good for elected members type approach. So I think that's something you could give us a bit of direction on. I think it's mixed across councils is my experience.
Well, it was the way that it was explained to me when I took on this role, that, you know, any gifts were, you know, unless they were a minor thing, that they were expected to be part of an HDC collective.
So happy to, when we come forward for the 14th of September, happy to incorporate that in as a proposal. Yeah.
I guess if you talk about a minor nature, what is classified as minor? I guess where does that sit? Was that splitting hairs?
I believe some of those definitions are included in the policy. So things like pens, fridge magnets, and things of a minor nature, rather than it being a gift that is more substantial.
How I would describe it to staff is it's the front page of the newspaper test. It's, you know, council staff receives free pen, who cares? Council staff receives night accommodation at the chateau from contractor.
Just one thing to mention as well is in regards to, for example, the policy like the fraud prevention policy, one thing that recommends is that we hold ongoing training, fraud awareness training. So you would see in the new training in our work program, things, you expect to see things in our risk report and ongoing reporting that we are holding and running those types of workshops and ongoing training to make sure that these policies for staff they're well aware of them, and that also we're making sure that if there are instances where things are not happening in the way that we should, that we raise them, but also that we're actively monitoring everything from this perspective to make sure that we've got compliance.
Can I ask a question? In the particular fraud policy, we talk about
and comes from personal experience where I investigated the fraud, and we couldn't actually pin the fraud on a particular person because the person got dismissed, but couldn't be unfraud. They said to contractor A, I'll give you this contract, providing you use my wife's badge as the office and you pay my wife $100 per week. Right? Now, because it was actually the benefit wasn't to the staff member. So I wonder whether the fraud protection policy might want to consider it or a related person, which you've got very nicely set out in conflicts of interest. The same personal relationship. I know it was probably made standard on its own from a lawyer's perspective, but no, it was a tough one to prove. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, having read the definitions of fraud and corruption, I think that probably covers the scenario that you're talking about. Like, I think under corruption, it talks about procuring benefit for self or another person. And then even the definition or the language in terms of fraud, I think it's implied that it could be about personal gain to your family, to your household. So, I don't know if you need to be more specific around that particular scenario. That would just be my
Problem with their policy and knowing the organisation, I'm not really surprised. Right, so I'll just raise that. The other one that I have is in reporting or investigating fraud. We've got it. What happens if an elected member is there's an accusation of fraud against an elected member? Who does the investigation? Is it the chief executive? Sorry.
Code of conduct policy applies, and your code of conduct policy is quite clear across most councils these days that you get someone independent in. Yeah.
Last comment was that a number of policies that I have seen in terms of if a fraud is proven, that the file is automatically given to the police and they decide to prosecute or not. It's not left up to the chief executive to make that decision. So it's quite clear. If the fraud is proven, we're giving the file to the police for them to undertake criminal investigation. We won't decide whether we will or we won't give that information to the police. So it's an automatic once it's proven.
I think that's covered by Section 9, and there's a bullet there that says recovering losses of money and property is a major objective of HTC. Following any fraud investigation, the amount of any loss would be quantified as far as possible. Repayment or reparations and prosecution pursued. That strong enough?
That I have problems with, and I haven't had time, but I've only got this sort of a wee while ago, was that as far as possible. So could you actually say as far as possible, could you read far as possible, can prosecution proceed? I would probably like to see it explicit. But I don't think you can, because it's not your decision to prosecute. It's police. So I would suggest that you wouldn't need that, because I would suggest that the council position would be to prosecute. That's what you do, but the police will make a decision whether they want or not. Absolutely. But I have seen some organisations where there's been a case where there was fraud proven, they thought, well, it's actually easier just to let the person go and not take any action rather than actually pass the information on to the police for them to make a decision.
perhaps a workable solution then might just be a sentence in that section 9 that says that unless exceptional circumstances apply, council will make a complaint to police as a default setting or something. I don't know. Yeah, because you're right. We make the complaint and then it's then up to the police to make the decision as to whether to prosecute.
So I think what's important here is, like, this is a workshop giving elected members and our independents an opportunity to test our thinking around the policy work, make sure that, is there something that doesn't make sense here? Of course, there is still an item that will come to the council table on the 14th of September for you to formally consider the report and the policies and consider the adoption. But this is I suppose, another layer of opportunity for you to influence the shape and direction of the policy, all which are pretty foundational policies from a checks and balances perspective, from a good governance perspective.
Thanks very much. If there's no more comments, then we'll finish up. Thank you for your time.